On a rain-soaked field in northern France, October 25th, 1415, two armies faced each other across a muddy expanse that would soon run red with blood. On one side stood the flower of French chivalry, thousands upon thousands of armored knights, their banners snapping in the cold autumn wind. On the other, a ragged band of English soldiers, sick, starved, and outnumbered beyond all reason. What happened next would shatter the myth of invincible French knighthood and echo through the centuries as one of the most shocking military upsets in history. This is the story of Agincourt, a battle where technology met tradition, where mud became a weapon, and where a young English king named Henry V gambled everything on a single desperate fight. The odds were staggering. Recent scholarship suggests the French fielded perhaps 12 to 15,000 men against Henry's exhausted force of maybe 6,000. But even those numbers don't tell the full story of just how hopeless the English situation truly was. By the time Henry's army reached that field near the village of Agincourt, they had already been through hell. Dysentery, the bloody flux as they called it, had torn through their ranks like wildfire. Men were literally cutting off their soiled clothing just to function. They were hungry, disease-ridden, and hundreds of miles from home. Yet somehow, in the space of just a few hours, these desperate soldiers would achieve something that military historians still struggle to fully explain. But to understand how such an impossible victory came to pass, we need to step back and see how Henry's grand ambition led him to this muddy killing ground. Because Agincourt wasn't just a battle, it was the climax of a campaign that had gone catastrophically wrong from the very beginning. The year was 1415, and Europe was a powder keg of dynastic rivalries and territorial disputes. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been raging on and off for nearly 8 decades, a brutal conflict born from competing claims to the French throne and vast territories across the Channel. Henry V, just 28 years old and barely 5 years on the throne, saw an opportunity that was too tempting to resist. France was weak, torn apart by internal strife. King Charles VI was descending into madness, his nobles fighting amongst themselves for power while the kingdom bled from civil war. The Armagnacs and Burgundians, two powerful factions, were at each other's throats, leaving France vulnerable to foreign invasion. For Henry, this chaos represented the perfect moment to press his ancestral claims to French territory, and perhaps even the crown itself. But Henry's motives weren't purely territorial. Back home in England, his legitimacy was still questioned by some. His father, Henry IV, had seized the throne by force from Richard II in 1399, and the House of Lancaster's grip on power remained tenuous. A glorious foreign war, Henry calculated, would unite his kingdom behind him and silence any remaining doubters. Nothing quite like a victory over the ancient enemy to rally the people around their king. The price of this ambition was staggering. Henry borrowed massive sums to finance his expedition, pawning royal treasures and even his crown jewels to raise the funds needed for what would become one of the most expensive military campaigns of the medieval period. London alone loaned him the equivalent of millions in modern currency. Every wealthy merchant, every noble family, every major city was pressed to contribute to the war chest. Henry was betting everything on this August 1415, Henry's invasion single throw of the dice. In fleet crossed the English Channel and landed at Harfleur, a strategic port city in Normandy. His army was impressive by medieval standards, perhaps 12,000 strong, including some of the finest knights and archers in Europe. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Take Harfleur quickly, establish a foothold in Normandy, then march inland to claim his rightful inheritance. But war, as they say, rarely goes according to plan. The siege of Harfleur turned into a nightmare. What Henry expected to be a quick conquest stretched on for 5 grueling weeks. The defenders, led by the experienced Raoul de Gaucourt, fought with desperate courage, turning every street into a battleground. But it wasn't just French resistance that decimated Henry's army. Disease struck with devastating force. Dysentery, the scourge of medieval armies, swept through the English ranks like the angel of death. Men dropped by the hundreds, their bodies racked by fever and bloody flux. The stench of sickness hung over the camp like a curse. Soldiers who had survived the crossing and the brutal siege work found themselves laid low by an enemy they couldn't fight with sword or bow. By the time Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's magnificent army was a shadow of its former self. Half his men were dead, dying, or too sick to fight. Of the 12,000 who had landed in August, perhaps 6,000 remained fit for duty. The cream of English knighthood had been reduced to a sickly remnant, and the campaign had barely begun. Any sensible commander would have declared victory, garrisoned Harfleur, and sailed home to England. The port city was a valuable prize, and Henry had achieved something significant by capturing it. His advisors certainly urged him to take this course. The risks of continuing the campaign with such a weakened force were obvious to everyone. But Henry V was not known for taking the sensible path. He was young, ambitious, and convinced of his own destiny. Perhaps he feared that returning home with only Harfleur to show for his massive investment would make him look weak. Perhaps he genuinely believed that God was on his side and would deliver him from any danger. Or perhaps he simply couldn't resist the challenge of leading his men across hostile territory to the safety of English-held Calais. On October 8th, Henry made the decision that would lead directly to the field of Agincourt. Instead of sailing home from Harfleur, he would march overland to Calais, a distance of roughly 150 miles through the heart of enemy territory. It was a decision that baffled his contemporaries and continues to puzzle historians today. From a military standpoint, it made little sense. The English controlled the seas, and Henry could have reached Calais by ship without risking his army. But there was a political dimension to the march that may have driven Henry's thinking. A successful overland expedition would demonstrate English power and French weakness. It would show that an English army could march the length of Normandy with impunity, striking fear into French hearts and potentially encouraging more cities to submit without a fight. The march was as much about propaganda as it was about getting from point A to point B. The reality proved far different from Henry's optimistic vision. As the English army struck out across the Norman countryside, French forces began to shadow their movements. Rivers that should have been fordable were defended by enemy troops. Bridges were destroyed or heavily guarded. The French, learning from their earlier defeats, were determined not to let the English march unmolested through their territory. The Somme River proved to be the decisive obstacle. Henry had planned to cross at the same ford his great-grandfather Edward III had used before the Battle of Crécy, but French forces were waiting for him. Unable to force the crossing, the English army was compelled to march further inland, searching desperately for an undefended ford while precious time and supplies drained away. Day after day, the sick and exhausted English soldiers trudged through the autumn mud, their boots wearing thin, their rations running low. Behind them, French cavalry harassed their rear guard. Ahead, enemy scouts tracked their every move, reporting back to the main French army that was assembling to intercept them. The trap was closing with each mile they marched. Finally, after days of searching, Henry's men found a crossing point at Agincourt, but the delay had been catastrophic. While the English had been wandering along the riverbank, a massive French army had gathered under the command of Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Jean Lemaingre, called Boucicaut. These were no mere local militias, but the finest fighting men France could muster, eager to avenge their earlier defeats and crush the English invaders once and for all. On October 24th, as Henry's weary army approached the village of Agincourt, they found their path blocked by this formidable host. There would be no avoiding battle now. The English were trapped between the French army and the sea, with no hope of reaching Calais without fighting their way through thousands of enemy soldiers. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations in medieval history. As darkness fell on October 24th, the two armies settled into an uneasy night just hundreds of yards apart. The contrast between the two camps could not have been more stark. On the French side, pavilions glowed with candlelight as nobles feasted and drank wine, their servants polishing armor that gleamed like mirrors. Laughter and boasts echoed across the field as knights wagered on who would capture the most English prisoners come morning. To them, the battle was already won. It was simply a matter of dividing the spoils. The English camp told a different story entirely. Huddled around sputtering fires, Henry's men tried to stay warm in the cold October rain. Many had no tents, sleeping on the bare ground wrapped in whatever cloaks or blankets they could find. The stench of dysentery still hung heavy in the air. These were not the proud warriors who had landed at Harfleur 2 months earlier, but hollow-eyed survivors who had endured more hardship than most armies face in an entire campaign. Yet something remarkable happened in those dark hours before dawn. Instead of despair, a grim determination settled over the English ranks. Perhaps it was the presence of their young king, who moved among his soldiers offering words of encouragement and sharing their meager rations. Perhaps it was the knowledge that they had come too far and suffered too much to simply surrender now. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that they were about to face their greatest test and would meet it standing. Henry himself spent the night in prayer and preparation. Contemporary accounts describe him as calm, almost serene, despite the overwhelming odds against him. He understood better than anyone that tomorrow would likely see the destruction of his army and probably his own death. Yet he showed no sign of the fear that must have gnawed at him. This was leadership of the highest order, a king willing to share the fate of his humblest soldier. As the first grey light of St. Crispin's Day crept across the battlefield, both armies began to stir. The field that would soon be drenched in blood stretched roughly 1,000 yards between two thick woods, creating a natural funnel that would prove crucial to the day's events. Recent rains had turned the freshly ploughed earth into a treacherous quagmire, but few could have predicted just how decisive this mud would prove to be. Henry deployed his forces with the skill of a veteran commander despite his relative youth. His battle line stretched across the narrowest part of the field, anchored by dense woods on either flank that would prevent the French from using their superior numbers to outflank his position. In the center stood his men-at-arms, perhaps 1,500 knights and professional soldiers in whatever armor they possessed, but it was on the flanks where Henry placed his secret weapon. Nearly 5,000 longbowmen took their positions on either side of the main battle line, their 6-foot yew staves gleaming with moisture from the morning mist. These were not ordinary archers, but masters of what was arguably the most devastating ranged weapon of the medieval world. Years of training had sculpted their bodies into living engines of war. Their left arms, enlarged from drawing 100-pound bow weights, could loose arrows with enough force to punch through steel plate at close range. The English archers drove sharpened stakes into the muddy ground before their positions, creating a hedge of wooden spears angled toward the enemy. Any cavalry charge would have to navigate this forest of points while under constant arrow fire. It was a defensive arrangement that had proven devastatingly effective in previous English victories, but never against odds quite this severe. Across the field, the French army presented a sight that must have struck terror into English hearts. Rank upon rank of armored knights stretched as far as the eye could see, their colorful banners and polished steel creating a glittering tapestry of martial splendor. These were the flower of French nobility, men who had trained for war since childhood and possessed the finest equipment money could buy. The French battle plan was simplicity itself. They would advance in 3 massive waves, each one powerful enough to shatter any normal army. The first line consisted of dismounted men-at-arms, heavily armored knights fighting on foot to avoid the tactical mistakes that had plagued French cavalry in earlier battles. Behind them rode hundreds of mounted knights, ready to exploit any breakthrough. A third line of reserves waited to deliver the final blow against whatever remained of the English forces. It was a plan born of supreme confidence and recent tactical innovations. The French had learned from their defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, where reckless cavalry charges had been broken by English arrows and disciplined infantry. This time they would advance methodically, using their superior numbers and protection to grind down the English line through sheer attrition. Against any reasonable assessment of the forces involved, it should have worked perfectly. But the French commanders had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that their enemies were the same sort of opponents they were accustomed to facing, knights and men-at-arms who would meet them in honorable combat, according to the established rules of chivalric warfare. They had not properly accounted for what desperation could drive ordinary men to accomplish. As the morning wore on, neither army seemed eager to make the first move. The French, confident in their overwhelming advantage, were content to wait for reinforcements that might still be marching to join them. Why risk unnecessary casualties when time was on their side? Henry, meanwhile, faced a terrible dilemma. His supplies were nearly exhausted, his men were growing weaker by the hour, and every moment of delay favored his enemies. Finally, Around 11 in the morning, Henry made the decision that would determine the fate of both kingdoms. Rather than wait for the French to attack on their own terms, he would force the issue. The English army began to advance across the muddy field, their banners streaming in the wind, their war cries echoing between the woods. It was an act of supreme audacity, a sick and outnumbered force deliberately provoking a battle against impossible odds. The sight of the English advance galvanized the French army into action. Horns blared across their lines as commanders shouted orders and knights lowered their visors. The moment they had been anticipating was finally at hand. Soon the muddy field of Agincourt would witness a collision between two worlds, two ways of war, two very different ideas about what made a man truly dangerous on the battlefield. As the distance between the armies shrank, English archers began to test their range, sending exploratory flights of arrows arcing through the grey October sky. Most fell short, but a few found their mark, bringing down French knights in sprays of blood and sparks. The battle was beginning, and with it would come a slaughter unlike anything medieval Europe had ever witnessed. The French response was swift and terrible to behold. Drums thundered across their lines as the first wave of dismounted knights began their advance, a wall of steel and silk banners moving with the measured pace of men who knew victory was theirs by right. These were not the wild cavalry charges of earlier wars, but the disciplined advance of professional warriors who had learned from past defeats. Each man was encased in the finest plate armor that French armorers could forge, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness despite the grey morning light. At their head marched some of the greatest names in French nobility. The Constable Charles d'Albret himself led the center, his azure and gold banner marking him as the supreme commander of French arms. Beside him strode Marshal Boucicaut, a knight so renowned for his prowess that his very presence on the battlefield was said to be worth 1,000 ordinary soldiers. These were men who had fought across Europe, from the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Prussia, and they had never known defeat. But as the French line began its inexorable advance across that 1,000 yards of open ground, the field itself began to exact its own terrible toll. What had seemed like ordinary farmland the night before had been transformed by the autumn rains into something far more sinister. The freshly plowed earth, softened by days of downpour, grabbed at boots and sucked at every step. Knights who had trained their entire lives for this moment found themselves struggling simply to maintain their footing. The weight of their armor, normally distributed perfectly for mounted combat or fighting on solid ground, became a crushing burden in the clinging mud. Men who could dance through sword forms with elegant precision on castle courtyards now labored forward like drowning swimmers, each step requiring enormous effort. Visors fogged with exertion. Breath came in ragged gasps. The proud advance began to slow and fragment as individual knights fell behind, unable to match the pace of their stronger comrades. Henry watched this struggle from his position in the English center, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the enemy approach. This was the moment he had gambled everything on, the convergence of terrain, weather, and English archery that might just level the impossible odds his army faced. At his signal, the longbowmen drew their massive yew-staves to full extension, muscles straining against draw weights that would cripple ordinary men. The first volley rose like a cloud of death, thousands of cloth-yard shafts climbing high into the grey sky before beginning their deadly descent. The sound was unlike anything in nature, a whistling hiss that seemed to fill the entire world. French knights looked up to see the sky itself turning dark, as if the sun had been blotted out by a plague of wooden locusts. Then the arrows began to fall. The effect was catastrophic beyond anything the French commanders had anticipated. Shafts driven by 100-pound draw weights struck with the force of sledgehammers, punching through even the finest armor when they found the right angle. Knights who had believed themselves invulnerable discovered gaps in their protection they had never known existed. Arrows found their way between plates, through visors, under aventails, and into the joints where even the best armorers had to compromise between protection and mobility. But it was not just the direct hits that created chaos in the French ranks. Horses reared and screamed as arrows struck their unprotected flanks. Men stumbled and fell as shafts glanced off their helmets, stunning them even when they failed to penetrate. The carefully ordered advance dissolved into confusion as knights tried to shield themselves from the relentless hail while still moving forward through the treacherous mud. English archers, their bodies shaped by years of training into living war machines, maintained a rate of fire that seemed almost supernatural to their enemies. Every 4 seconds, another flight of arrows rose from the English line. Every 4 seconds, more French knights fell or staggered under impacts that rang like hammer blows on anvils. The narrow front between the two woods meant that the longbowmen could concentrate their fire with devastating effect, creating a killing zone where survival became purely a matter of chance. Those French knights who somehow made it through the arrow storm arrived at the English line in no condition to fight. Exhausted by their struggle through the mud, battered by impacts that had left them dazed and disoriented, they faced fresh English men-at-arms who had conserved their strength for this moment. What followed was not the glorious combat of chivalric romance, but brutal, desperate butchery. English soldiers armed with hammers, maces, and daggers swarmed over fallen knights, striking at visors and seeking the gaps in their armor with practiced efficiency. These were not noble duels, but the grim work of professional killers who understood that their survival depended on ending fights as quickly as possible. The muddy ground became a charnel house as French nobility, the flower of their kingdom, died in agony beneath English weapons. But the horror was only beginning. Behind the first French line, a second wave of mounted knights had been watching their comrades struggle with growing alarm. As reports filtered back of the disaster unfolding at the English position, these mounted warriors spurred their destriers forward, determined to break through where their dismounted brothers had failed. The cavalry charge that followed would have been magnificent to witness under different circumstances. Hundreds of armored knights thundering across the field, their lances leveled, their battle cries echoing off the surrounding woods. These were the same tactics that had dominated European battlefields for centuries, the unstoppable power of heavy cavalry that had made knights the masters of medieval warfare. But at Agincourt, the charge met the same conditions that had destroyed the first attack. Horses struggled through the clinging mud, their powerful legs working frantically to maintain forward momentum. Riders found their mounts stumbling and sliding beneath them, the precision timing required for an effective lance attack impossible to maintain on such treacherous ground. The English stakes, driven deep into the earth at angles calculated to impale charging horses, created another layer of obstacles that broke up the cavalry formation. Animals that had been trained from birth for war shied away from the wooden points or impaled themselves in their efforts to reach the enemy. Riders thrown from their mounts found themselves trapped beneath hundreds of pounds of horseflesh, drowning in mud mixed with blood. Those cavalrymen who somehow reached the English line discovered that their height advantage meant nothing when facing disciplined infantry who had prepared specifically for their arrival. English billhooks and halberds reached up to drag knights from their saddles. Archers abandoned their bows for falchions and warhammers, closing in on isolated horsemen like wolves, bringing down a stag. The second French attack collapsed even more completely than the first, leaving the field littered with the bodies of men and horses. The narrow space between the woods had become so choked with corpses that movement was becoming nearly impossible. French knights stumbled over the bodies of their own comrades, while English soldiers methodically finished off any enemies who still showed signs of life. Henry himself had fought in the thick of the melee, his royal surcoat making him a target for every French knight who thought to win eternal glory by killing the English king. Multiple enemies converged on his position during the fighting, and only the intervention of his household knights saved him from being overwhelmed. His crown was dented by axe blows, and several of his companions fell defending him, but the young king emerged from the combat unscathed. The field of Agincourt stands as one of history's most stunning reversals, where a handful of sick and starving English soldiers shattered the military pride of an empire. Against impossible odds, Henry's longbowmen had turned mud into an ally and desperation into victory, proving that courage and cunning could triumph over overwhelming force. The battle would echo through centuries, a testament to the power of determination when everything seems lost.